Hello and welcome to Alchemy Radio, where the only thing we ask of you is that you keep an open mind. Today's guest is Stuart Wilde, who is considered by many the greatest living metaphysician in the world today. In the last 12 years, he's had over 100,000 visions, which have taught him a vast body of information not available elsewhere. Many of the most famous New Age, New Thought writers and teachers have privately studied with him or have been greatly influenced by his work. In 2001, Wilde discovered the Morph phenomenon, a process by which physical reality goes transparent and soapy-looking and humans dematerialize. Watching the transcendental nature of Morph for 8 years, he gradually wrote out in details the topography and exact nature of what is now known as the Aluna, mirror worlds, sometimes referred to as the spirit worlds. Much of that information has since been verified by many others who have greatly added to his initial work. In the 1980s, Wilde correctly described the etheric life field around humans in precise detail. Previously, it was known only in vague terms in discussions about the human aura. Wilde wrote out the first of many precise and verifiable etheric exercises and sensations in his book, The Quickening. Over the last 10 years, he has published hundreds of his visions, many of which have now come to pass. He's written 20 books which have sold in the millions, and they've been translated into 15 languages. Stuart, you're very welcome to Alchemy Radio. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much, and I'm really delighted to be here in Dublin. It's always been one of my favourite cities.
Well, delighted to hear it, and very excited to have you on the show, because you're somebody who has just such a wealth of knowledge and information that we're going to talk about in depth. But before we get into, I suppose, the meat, Stuart, tell us a little bit about your background, or quite a bit about your background, if you like, because there's so much there. How did you get from where you were to where you are now?
Well, when I was a young lad at a sort of very austere English public school, a Catholic school, I sort of, like most kids, I think, sort of dreamt to become free. And I hid in the roof of the gymnasium for 3 years. And I had a group of friends there, and we sort of sold cigarettes and chocolates and whatever the kids wanted that they couldn't get, because it wasn't a boarding school where you could just walk out into the town. But it was that desire for freedom, and then I began to I trained as a medium at the College of Psychic Studies, and I read a book that my mother gave me called The Powers That Be, and her brother, or her uncle, I think, was a medium, and so I got involved in that spirit mediumship stuff, and then I wrote 20 books, and then I went into the music business, and I wrote 6 albums, and an opera, a small opera, an operetta. And I've written a couple of films, and so I've just always been a writer of consciousness, sort of teaching people how to become free.
And that's something that's really needed in today's world, because as many of us are aware, and I suppose so many of us are not aware, things are not always as they seem in the world at the moment. So what was it? What was the spur for you to, I suppose, take a more broad outlook on the world around us and the way things actually are? And how did you become conscious of consciousness, if that's not a paradox?
Well, I meditated a lot, and I started to go into trance every single day, sometimes 2 or 3 hours. Not all in one stretch, but like an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, and 20 minutes at night. And I started to see visions. And then in the year 2000, a really strange thing happened. I was in my house in Australia, and there was a meditation group there of about 15 people. And they all started to have these coloured dots and patterns, geometric patterns on their skin, that just appeared out of nowhere. And then they began to dematerialize, and the walls started going soapy-looking. You imagine you could even walk through the wall. And I termed that phenomenon the Morph, because it moved everything. I mean, it oscillates the sort of, the sofa. You can see the sofa jiggling.
Okay.
And it was through that experience of the Morph that I then had like 200,000 visions that came from that body of information.
Okay, so the Morph phenomenon then it reminds me a little bit of people who speak about maybe a holographic universe or that kind of thing, whereby we can create our own solid environment, our own reality through vibration, that kind of thing. It's almost like a breaking down of the matrix, so to speak. I know people like David Icke speak about that in depth. Is that the kind of phenomenon that you're talking about?
Yes, very much so. I mean, for example, it wasn't long after that I began to see people completely dematerialize. And the first time I saw it, in sort of in a normal ambience. I was at a fire at a shamanistic ceremony in Brazil, and there was a man there, and he started flicking out, and I was watching him, and he was kneeling in front of me. Then he stood up, and he completely disappeared. But what was fascinating was he had a cigarette in his hand, and as he walked around the fire to the other side of the lawn, I could see the cigarette come up to his mouth and glow, and then come down again, and then come up to his mouth and glow and go down again. And he wasn't there. But since that, myself and others that are involved in this sort of mystical journey, we've seen the dematerialization of a human 1,000 times. I mean, literally, we stopped counting after 1,000 times, because it was sort of like we just knew they could dematerialize. So the human body is solid, and it's non-solid. So it has a sort of wavy, a hazy wave state and a solid particle state.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think then causes you or allows you to see the morph phenomenon, Stuart?
I don't know. It's something that's triggered in the brain. It must be. It's a sort of a point of perception. It's certainly difficult to see in bright sunlight. It's much easier to see in a hazy light of an evening. Mm-hmm. Although on the first day when we saw it in Australia, it was mid-afternoon and the sun was shining through the windows. So you can see it in every light. And, I think we're perpetually here and not here at the same time. It's just a matter of, sometimes the brain clicks, you can see it. And the rest of the time, you're walking along St. Stephen's Green and you can't see it, because you're off going to work, So I think it is a perpetual state of humanity that they're clicking in and out of their solidity.
And so essentially we almost have a Schrodinger's cat scenario whereby things are happening in almost parallel universes at the same time, and it's up to us then to manifest which universe we're a part of at any given time.
That's exactly it. One thing that I discovered in the Morph and through these 200,000 visions that I've seen is that there's a parallel universe very close to us. If you stretch your arm out, it starts halfway between your elbow and your wrist. So it's about 18 inches off the end of your nose, and that's where the parallel universe starts. And in that universe are like heavens and hells and limbos and celestial golden landscapes and all manner of existence is going on in this mirror world. And so heaven and hell are not sort of out in space. They're close. They're really close.
I think it's very important for people at this point, sorry to interject, just to be aware of the fact that we're not just in a five-sense reality, and that's really what we're brought up to believe. It's just what we can see and touch and smell, etc., etc. There is far more out there, and even science is starting to acknowledge that through quantum physics and quantum theory, and we are in an interdimensional world, and as more and more people speak about their experiences of accessing these different dimensions, I think it becomes less of a taboo subject, and we will be talking a lot about that, so I think it's just important to let people know about that at this point.
Yes, I mean, it could be that every one of our senses has 9 dimensions to it, and we only see the one dimension. So we have the one dimension of hearing with the one dimension of sight. But beyond that, there are other dimensions of sight that we don't normally access. So I don't know whether we necessarily have more than 5 senses, but we definitely have heightened senses. And at times, it just clicks in. It's there, and you can see it. And then eventually, if you're calm and you meditate, and you've got a sort of clean soul, those worlds open up more and more and more. And I've had an extraordinary journey, and I've taken a lot of people with me. I mean, thousands upon tens of thousands.
And I think a good practical example then, Stuart, of that is if you take a cat can see different things because they have access to a different light spectrum that we do. They can see things that we can't see. They're not visible to the human naked eye. And that's, I suppose, a practical example of exactly what we're speaking about, albeit in a more heightened state.
That is exactly it. And of course, dogs can't see colour, but they've got this acute sense of hearing and smell. And so they compensate from the fact that they live in a kind of grey, colourless world for their heightened perception in the other senses. So, yes, it's just, I think, because there's a shift going on, there's a quickening happening now. And people are sort of realizing that, like, there's a perception beyond the dogma and the normal. That's not to make the religions wrong, but to say that, like, hey, beyond that, you can learn to see things. And it's like, I write from a metaphysical perspective on my site, stuartwilde.com, and I try to give people the inside story, the story behind the story, like what's happening at an energy level with the New World Order and, you know, Bush and Blair and Iraq and all this stuff. So there's a wideness to it. It's almost like as you let go and you go wider and wider and wider, you see more.
And of course, there's a lot of dot connecting that goes on with that as well. So you've mentioned, I suppose, the geopolitical spectrum that we're living in at the moment. Let's talk about that for a second. What's your perspective on the world around us? And you mentioned New World Order, and I suppose it's topical at the moment because the US presidential election has just happened. So let's talk about that for a little while, Stuart.
Well, I made a YouTube recently that somebody else picked up, and they put pictures of music on it, and it's called The New World Order is Dead on Arrival. And what I've said is that these old men that invented the New World Order, let's say like Bush Sr., he first mentioned it almost 20 years ago, it's just their sort of flabby dreams of control and power and money and so forth. But I believe that, like, karmically, they won't be allowed to go there. You know, it's not going to happen. And economic situations and people rising up and attempting to wrest back control, political control for themselves will happen a long time before some flabby old git like Bush becomes sort of the ruler of the world. And so I don't think the New World Order has much chance. But yeah, we are in the age of, like, you know, surveillance and violence and state-sponsored violence and so forth. And, I mean, people like Obama and so forth, I mean, they're devils. You know, they're devils, John. These are devil beings. I mean, they're like aliens that have come from another planet. That, like, you know, glory and pain in subjugating people and so forth. And their time has to run. They have to have their moment of glory. And eventually they fall, because all evil meets a superior force up ahead. So, you know, Hitler met the Russians and his armies were rubbed out. It happens all the time. And that tyrant falls because a bigger tyrant knocks him over. So a superior force in this case now in the world is really this force of people's awareness. It's almost like the light came, landed, and now people are aware, and now they can see the emperor is a fascist with no clothes. And that's really what I write about a lot, is how evil these people are. They're not normal. Did you know, John, that, like, Tony Blair was indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague of war crimes? Like, I don't know if it was a few weeks ago or a month ago. Him and Bush have both been indicted. There are warrants out for their arrest. And Bush was on his way. This is Bush Jr. now.
Yeah.
Bush was on his way to Switzerland, and his lawyers advised him not to go because Switzerland was one of the countries where the writ could be served and he could have been arrested if he'd gone there by accident. So you can see how, like, justice moves extremely slowly, but it is beginning to move. And these men are, like, not as free as they were before. A site called Boston.com reported that Bush has been in hiding for 3 months. So that tells you how, like, their world is getting smaller. They're not growing to become rulers of the world, quite the reverse. Their world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the forces of righteousness and justice, like the International Criminal Court in The Hague, close in on these people. There's a court case this month against Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney for rendition and torture. Rendition was the system whereby America shipped prisoners to sort of third world countries to be tortured. And the International Criminal Court is hearing those cases in the month of November. I'm looking forward to finding out what the outcome is. But these people do not have a free reign anymore. You know, the same way as in the Catholic Church. The Pope does not have a free reign, you know, when he protected the pedophiles and stuff. He's not able to do that. And I have a friend who's an insider, who's quite a high layperson in the Catholic Church, an official, you know?
Yeah.
And he was telling me that the pedophilia in the Catholic Church is getting better and better and better because these priests and these demonic systems that allow for that are now being kind of watched and corralled and held down. They're not allowed to go to those types of activities as freely as before. So there's a lot of hope for all of us.
And I think there is a lot of hope needed also, because on the outside looking in at the moment, if you're to look at the way, particularly the Western world, is heading, you look at surveillance society, and it's almost like a mixture between George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. They're like the blueprints for the world we're living in now. So you've Orwell's surveillance society, and then you've Aldous Huxley with bread and circuses, in essence, for the masses to keep people distracted. And when I look around myself in Ireland and beyond, that's exactly what I'm seeing, and to an increasing level. But it's also very encouraging then that there are so many people who seem to be waking up or becoming conscious. And when do you think we might reach that tipping point? Because you spoke there, Stuart, about a karmic reaction and how karma is not going to allow this control system to eventually win, and that it is in its death throes. When can we expect the tipping point, or the 100th monkey, so to speak?
Well, I think it's going to be an economic thing. You know, when you go down to the bank and it's shut and you can't get your cash out of the ATM, I think that's when the people will go on the streets. But from a more metaphysical perspective, it's all to do with heat. I've spent 4,500 hours in trance looking inside those hell worlds and the celestial worlds, but particularly the hell worlds. Mm-hmm. Because I was allowed to go in there and fire a special digital dot that destroyed some of the demons in there. And the hell worlds are cold. They're not like the Bible that says it's all flames. It's cold. And there are places in the hell world where you see flames, but they're cold flames. They're really strange because the flames are not hot. The hell worlds are cold, and the sort of cold cruelty of the human mind, or the cold cruelty of these psychopaths in power, and the sadomasochism of the laws and the terror that they create, is a coldness. Now, what makes Ireland unique in the world is the warmth of its people. They're very, very warm, and they're very friendly, and they have a sort of glowing soul automatically. Even if a person doesn't have a great knowledge of these metaphysical things or whatever, and the concepts might sound strange to him or her, they still have this glow. And so Ireland, I think, has got the best chance in the world to eventually becoming free. And eventually, when they get out of the euro and they get out of all this nonsense, they can go back to being the people that they were before these strange sort of megalomaniac politicians took power.
Yeah, because what you described there is the traditional outside view of the Irish people and the Irish nation, and from the inside then looking out, a lot of Irish people have become quite disillusioned with the country as a whole because of political control and because of pandering to economic European concerns and world concerns. And a lot of people are choosing to look the other way, I think. This is in parallel to a lot of other people waking up, and that's a source of frustration for many, because the traditional Irish warmth, or the traditional Irish outlook on life, for a lot of people has been dumbed down or dampened somewhat, which is, it's unfortunate, I think. But you think that's going to change?
I think it will, because I think the warmth wins in the end. Because warmth is that golden light of God in your heart. And whether it's just like you're having a laugh with your mates in the pub, or you're on your way to work and you're talking to the passenger sitting in the bus with you, it's like, it's always there. Okay, you look at these systems, and you can see how chronic they are. I mean, I was at Gerald Cilente's lecture in Dublin last night, and it was very, very entertaining. I mean, he's a funny guy. And at the end, there were a few questions, and you could hear people's frustration, and they were talking about fluoride in the water and GM foods, and you can see how, like, people look at this and say, this is a clog. I mean, absolutely, it's a load of rubbish. But these ugly forces have to play themselves out, and eventually I'm sure Ireland will fight to win its own independence again, the same way as it fought to win its independence from the British.
And do you think, Stuart, the best way to fight a control system such as this is in a physical way, or a metaphysical way, or a spiritual way?
Well, I think it should be done on all levels. You know, you can develop your power metaphysically by being calm and meditating, and you can evolve spiritually by reading books of myself and other people, Deepak Chopra say. But then also there will be a moment when people do have to turn out, in the streets and protest, and that day will come, because I've seen really, really disturbing visions of food shortages and tanks in the streets and so forth. But it's a catharsis, it's a sort of transformation that we have to go through to realize that we don't need these leaders, we only need each other. The love that we have for each other is enough to run the country and get the trains to go on time. We don't need these leaders, we don't need these systems, we don't need these corrupt banks, and it's just an evil. And for the Irish state to have to pay higher taxes to pay off the debts of some mafia bank, that's a nonsense. I'm sure you can see why people are disillusioned.
Absolutely, and I think you speak about debts there and the economic situation in particular. The farce of it all is, and I think people are certainly waking up to this finally all over the world, is that it's a complete fiction. It's not even real. When we look at the monetary system, it's a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme that has to collapse eventually, whether we like it or whether we're willing to accept it at this point or not.
Yes, it's bound to. The ECB has created 22 trillion euros on the QT. They didn't exactly announce it, but it has been written up now by financial journalists. Well, where did that 22 trillion come from? Nowhere. They just keystroked it into a computer. But that means that all the other euros that are swishing about Europe are worth less now, because there's 22 trillion newcomers that dilute to dilute the money. And that's really what's happening with Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve. They can print trillions, 10 trillion, 20 trillion, 50 trillion, all in secret. So they're going to debase the currencies, and that's one of the worries that we have. And so a lot of people look to buying a bit of gold and so forth. And last night's lecture, there was a guy there, Stefan Kramer from Celtic Gold, that did a half presentation on why buying gold is a sensible thing, and silver as well. So these are real currencies that have a global worth, and what we have is what's known as a fiat currency, the fiat currency, that are just churned out the printing presses, and then of course now there's computers, they don't even need the printing press, they can just credit your account with 100 million in a matter of seconds.
You're spot on with that, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out from an economic point of view. But let's speak about your visions for a while, Stuart, because you've had hundreds of thousands of visions at this point. And first off, when did you have your first one? How did it come about? And how did things progress from there? Because I'm fascinated by this.
It started off quite slow when I was in my early 30s. And by the time I got to early 40s, it started to move a little bit quicker. But the main vision started in the year 2000, and they've been going unbelievably fast. They're visions about dimensions, like where the dimensions are. And then a lot of the visions I had have been of the heaven worlds and the hell worlds. And in the heavens there's celestial beings like the Hindu gods and Jesus and Buddha and so forth. And there's massively tall beings in the celestial world, and they're sort of 60, 80 feet high. And their visions have really been my teacher. They showed me the multi-dimensional universe that we exist in, but we call it a hyperverse because it's an inner universe of vast proportions. And so they've showed me things, and I've learned things about the destiny of the world. For example, I saw the visions of the food riots in Ireland and the collapse of the Catholic Church and various, bits of madness. But one of the first visions I ever saw was of a being, and she had this really strange sort of digital fractal eye. It was all gold, and it was in the front of her face, but the eye wrapped around through her ear, behind her, behind her face, behind the front of her face. So she had this wraparound golden eye that had circuitry. It was the most extraordinary thing, and the first thing she did was she showed me the destruction of Jerusalem. And I saw this bomb go off and Jerusalem ended. That was the first major vision of this era, which has been going now 12 years. And so I've seen these apocalyptic visions from time to time. And I don't dwell on them that much, but just understand that all of these systems are eventually going to be destroyed, and in the end we're left with the sound of water, and our hearts, our friendships among ourselves.
So how does one reconnect with that? Because in the modern society that we live in, no matter where we are in the world, there are so many distractions, and this again comes back to Aldous Huxley and his Brave New World, but there's so much going on, and whether it's in our own heads or outside external influences, it can be quite difficult for people to reconnect and I suppose to remember what it is and who we actually are.
Yes, I mean, that's the main thing. It's sort of remembering who you are. I mean, meditation's vital because it teaches you to calm the mind and to control your emotions. So sight of these other worlds happens when, like, your life force field that we call the etheric goes wider and wider. So the ego and, say, ambition and hurtling about and stress is vertical. And then when you sit to meditate, you go horizontal and doors open either side of you, left and right. So meditation, and then I talk a lot in my books about processing your own inner darkness, processing the shadow, and owning your fiddles and your spites and your anger and your emotional upsets. And you just got to own them and understand that they've traumatized people, and you have to belong to your own shadow, so to speak. Mm-hmm. It's not a mea culpa sort of chest beating type of thing. It's more introspection, looking at, wow, I didn't treat my auntie right because I ripped her off for €1,000, you know, that kind of stuff. And so it's a three-part process. It's beginning to be more calm, meditating, and also going through this shadow process where you look at, you know, who you actually are.
And how do you think people can, on a practical level, Stuart, reconnect with that? Say, for example, somebody who's never meditated in the past before. What would be the first step for somebody who realizes things aren't what we are led to believe and things are a little bit different and they would like to connect on a spiritual level with themselves?
Well, walking in nature and being on your own and staying calm is the first practical step. There isn't a magic wand, but it's this introspection, the inner journey, where you really begin to see that beyond the world of dogma and complications and so forth, there's a simplicity. So I tell people, hey, try to make your life as simple and as uncluttered as possible. So get rid of obligations, sell stuff that's surplus, that you don't need, get rid, calm and become like this Zen monk walking on the path. Now, not everybody can walk barefoot with just a stick and a little bundle of food in a hanky, but it's that idea of, like, there is absolute power in simplicity. And so I tell people, head towards simplicity. It doesn't matter if it takes you 5 or 10 years, but just start. Get rid of these, for example, relationships that don't work, which are, let's say, emotionally violent or disturbing or manipulative. And pare down and enhance the love and the friendship that does work. So each person has to evaluate their life and think, how does this work on an energy level? Is hanging out with this dude who's really angry and is virtually trying to rip me off, is that a sensible way of spending Saturday night? Or do I need to be doing something different? So it's combing through your life and attempting to make it more spiritual and simpler.
And let's talk for a second then about certain substances that could alter states of consciousness for people. Do you think they're a good thing, a bad thing, or, I mean, obviously we have synthetic drugs and we also have more natural drugs in inverted commas. We've plants and there are a lot of aids for people who are looking to, I suppose, access different points of attention. What's your experience of that down through the years, Stuart, and what are your favourites?
Well, I've been a great promoter of ayahuasca, which is a brew made from a vine that comes from the Amazon, and from a leaf, and they brew it up, and the essential component of ayahuasca is DMT, which is known as the spirit molecule. It fires the pineal and gives you dreams and visions and teaches you things.
Yeah.
And I think I would have sent probably about 5,000 people to the ayahuasca. A lot went to South America and others went to Amsterdam. And I have a friend who has a site called The Hidden Doorway and .com, and he does ayahuasca ceremonies all over. There's certain countries it's legal, like in Portugal. So. But yeah, I'm a great believer of people using ayahuasca And certainly when the mushrooms were legal, I used to take people on walks through the Irish forest. But I mean, really magical experiences, the most magical experiences of my life, really. Fairy walks, we used to call them, and we'd get a bottle of this mushroom tea, and we'd call it fairy liquid, and take it to the forest, and with a bottle of whiskey as well. And it was really the most fun we've ever had. But yeah, no, I do believe in these processes, and I've been a great believer of ayahuasca. Unfortunately, it's becoming ever more illegal nowadays as the board and control trying to move in on it.
Yeah, well, from a personal point of view, I can't understand how something that grows naturally in the ground can be banned or outlawed. It's utterly ridiculous to me and is part of the control system. But unfortunately, that is the way things are going at the moment until the spell is broken, so to speak. But back to the visions again. In terms of the visions that you've had, are they mainly prophecy visions, or are they of a random nature, or do you have any control over what it is when you're in that state? Have you any control over your reality at that time?
No, you're like sort of flicking TV channels. It comes to you regardless of, you don't have any volition over it. Yeah, a lot of the visions have been celestial. Like, for example, I've seen lots of visions of Jesus. 400 at least, where he's literally appeared in the room like a yard from me. And then I've seen visions of the Hindu gods, Vishnu, and particularly Hanuman. There's a monkey god, like a fighter. Mm-hmm. In Hinduism, Hanuman, I've seen him a lot, and he always appears from the right. And then I've seen the Buddha, the golden Buddha, a few times. I've even seen the Muslim Redeemer once, only just recently. He's called the Mahdi, M-A-D-H-I. So a lot of it is the celestial beings appearing, and of course they appear with a light, but it's more than just a pretty light. It's a lot of mathematical codes that they invest upon you. And I've had stigmata for 2.5 years, and it goes through my feet and my hand. It's like nails, and it's excruciatingly painful. But the visions accompanied me through it. The visions accompanied me through those stigmata and showed me. And then I got this light in my hands, and I can see the light with my eyes shut, which is extraordinary. That's inner sight, and I can see the light with my eyes open. This is in a darkened bedroom at night, not in bright sunlight.
Yeah.
And so I then wondered what on earth I was supposed to do with this, but it came out of the bang. And then I saw visions about doing hands-on healings, and so that's what I've been doing, going around Ireland in various places and stopping and doing hands-on healings on people.
And take us through that process. Is it something to do with the etheric life field when you're doing hands-on healings, or what is it in relation to, for anybody who might have absolutely no experience or knowledge of it?
It's a purple light. That's all I could say. And I see these hands come off, like what I call the Jesus hand. They're not necessarily the hands of Jesus, but they look like his hands, when you see them in paintings and stuff. Mm-hmm. And when I put my hands on somebody's shoulders, I see the purple hands come up 9 times. And that's like a vision or an inner sight thing. And once they come up 9 times, the healing's over. And then after that, I do some shamanistic prayers that I learned in Brazil and in the Amazon regions. And then that's it, 2 minutes. But I just got an email in from a solicitor in Galway.
Yep.
And he brought his auntie to St. Patrick's Well in Clonmel, where I used to do healing. And she was dying, but the doctors had written her off. And she's completely cancer-free, She's cancer-free now, 99%, the doctors say. They cannot find the cancer, but they give themselves that 1% just to cover themselves. So it took 4 months from when I did the hands-on healing on the solicitor's auntie to now, when she's had the test at the hospital. So there's no knowing, John. There's no knowing how on earth it works. I don't know how it works. It's like this purple light goes into people. It clears away the darkness, and then their body heals the cancer. And that's how it works.
And does it always work, Stuart, or does it appear to be of a random nature?
Well, there is a slight random element in it. And when I started, I was sort of silently saying to the beings around me or whatever, which in fact is just the 4 walls of my bedroom, I was saying, I don't want to do this work unless I can heal everybody of everything.
Hmm.
And then I was taken through a whole series of visions of how certain people karmically have to go through the diseases they go through because they create them. Do you follow me?
Yep.
It's way too complicated, and I don't want to be judgmental and say, well, this person was bitter and nasty, and so now they've got leukemia.
Okay.
There is, some people have to have the diseases they have, but most people are allowed a second chance. So I haven't got a definitive percentage, but I mean, my inkling would be 85 to 90% of the people can be cured, and 10 to 50% of them can't. Now, I met a guy in a pub at Lord's in London at a cricket match, and he had leukemia, and I talked to him about the healings, and he came to my hotel and I did a session on him. And 30 days later, he went to the hospital in Exeter, and they gave him a report that his leukemia was non-detectable. They could not detect the leukemia in his body. It's a gift from God. It's not really, we can't understand how these things work because they come from a higher place to follow.
And when you say God then, Stuart, I know there'll be a lot of listeners who might not necessarily believe in God or might not be overtly religious. Is God to you then a religious entity, or is there a place for organised, structured religion, or is it just something spiritual that you've put the label God upon? Are you talking about maybe a universal energetic power as opposed to a guy in a white beard, or have the visions told you something more?
It's both those two things, John. You know, there is the structured religion which helps people and gives them a sense of community and cohesiveness. But I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the religions don't know very much. You know, they sort of can't see.
Mm-hmm.
Once we see it by the inner world, what we call God is in fact a vast light. And the light is not just a pretty light, it's information, it's data. So I say in my books, I wrote a book called Grace, Gaia, and the End of Day.
Yep.
In there I explain that the light is information, and so grace and information are the same thing. Ignorance is a lack of grace. So if you want to put it in religious terms, well, there you have it loosely. But essentially, this light is vast and it's full of data, and the data travels. I don't know if your listeners would be familiar with like Mandelbrot's fractals, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the light has all these fractals and these mathematics in them. I mean, it's extraordinarily beautiful, the codes, the fractal codes. And that is information. So if you open your heart, you'll be given more information. So it's almost like you open your heart to what the Christians would call grace. And how grace appears is through information.
And many people have spoken, Stuart, about conscious points of attention, which a lot of what you're describing, to me, it's certainly my reading of what you're describing, is a conscious point of attention. And there are a number of methods, and quite often there are, I suppose, false prophets out there and people who will claim to be able to do certain things, be it healing or be it having, I don't know, there are a number of thousands of books out there, self-help books, that actually don't really help people at all. They provide maybe a placebo at best for people. So let's talk about the placebo effect for a second, because it is an acknowledged scientific thing that people can be cured through the power of their own mind. Do you think that's a chemical or a scientific factor at work, or is it actually the spiritual world or somebody opening up to the spiritual world without necessarily realizing it themselves?
I think people have the intrinsic power to heal themselves. But, for example, I've been to Lourdes and some of the sacred sites, Santiago de la Compostela,
Mm-hmm.
and various places like that, Chartres and so on. And when you go to Lourdes, the first thing they tell you is there hasn't been a miracle there in 30 years. So
Right.
that's how much placebo effect there is.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm going to go to Lourdes and do some healings there next year sometime. But the placebo effect, I think, is definitely possible, but I don't know how effective it is, and I think people should rely on their medication and their doctors in case the placebo thing doesn't work for them.
So obviously you think there is a place then for medicine. But that leads us on to natural medicine and natural healing, because there's been a backlash, particularly in Ireland and the UK, over the last year to 2 years that I've noticed, against the likes of homeopathy, and people saying, and particularly the established medical professionals saying that it's absolute nonsense and it's codswallop and it's this, that and the other. But I think a lot of the research and studies that have been done into water memory and homeopathy and energy structures on a quantum level are showing that this is something that physically is possible if we need physical proof, as so many people do, of things. So what's your take on homeopathy and natural remedies versus, I suppose, mainstream medical science and big pharma, which so many of us have so many issues with?
I'm very, very keen on healing remedies and herbs, and homeopathy is an information thing. You know, I was saying grace is information, and by potentizing, let's say, a remedy and making it into a homeopathic pill, I'm sure it works. I mean, there's no question of it. But of course, it is the fascist nature of control to want to sort of regulate. For example, we used to make little bottles of mist, lavender mist, from the waters of St. Patrick's Well, and we put lavender in it and a little bit of alcohol to preserve it, and I'd bless the bottles and send them out to people, and we called it the Avalon Mist. Well, we were going fine, and we were only selling them at cost for €5. But suddenly the post office won't accept water in the mail. They won't accept liquid in the mail, because Tony Blair, some years ago, came up with this sort of mythical exploding liquid idea. And so suddenly our little sort of venture to sort of send this protection spray to people. You know, people would spray it on their kiddies' pillows at night if the children were disturbed by nightmares and stuff, or if they were disturbed by dark influences. So it's not a healing remedy as such, but it sort of is, because it made people better. And, I mean, they're going to close down on all this stuff. It's going to have to go underground, and the herbalists are going to have to grow the stuff in their greenhouses and so forth. Like, for example, how they banned St. John's wort, which is used for depression. So what I did on my site, stuartwilde.com, was I emailed all the readers, and there's a lot of them, and I said, if anybody would like me to send them 50 John wort seeds free of charge, I'll send them. And in the end, we sent out, I'm not sure, 50,000 seeds, maybe more, 100,000 seeds.
Wow.
People all over the world for them to plant the John's wort in their garden and stuff. It's not good to plant it in fields because it's poisonous to the cattle. But anyway, that was my way of pushing against these John's wort regulations. So it's just it's a very little protest. But hey, we had to buy the 100,000 seeds and pay somebody to put them into their envelope and post them to, we were posting them to Indonesia, China, Australia, all over the world.
And a personal protest like that, which became something so much more than personal, I think is the key to breaking a control system, assuming that that's exactly what we want to do. And I know it's certainly what I would like to do, and so many listeners would like to do, because I suppose the power that the control system has is only the power that we invest in them. So our silence is consent, and our subconscious consent is what drives them forward all the time and encourages them to, I suppose, increase the frequency and the tempo of what it is they're trying to do. So,
yeah, I think those are good words, frequency and tempo, because essentially it's a fascist thing. It's an evil. I think at the beginning people have to just withdraw and not get emotionally upset and begin to work on themselves, whether they go to Amsterdam and take ayahuasca, or whether they get involved in some kind of healing therapy, or crystal meditation circle, or whatever it is they want to do. First you pull away, then you get strong, then you attack. That would be my suggestion.
And what would you say to people who have experienced huge upheaval in their lives, for people who've decided to go down the path of spirituality or freedom and to go against the grain? Because that's very much what people are doing at this stage. They're going against the established order of things. And quite often that can lead, and I know in my own experience, it can lead to quite a lot of friction between yourself and the people around you, and even within yourself between what you're brought up to believe in, and when you cast that aside, suddenly you can at times feel, well, personally I could feel that I was floundering, or I was alone in the dark, so to speak, What would you say to people who are discouraged by that, or who think they mightn't have the fortitude or the strength to pull through it? Are there any kind of little tips or methods for people?
Well, I met a teacher in Brazil, and he was a very nice man. And he told me, you have to love your tormentors. He says the only way you can escape from torment is by loving them. And I've known that's always stuck in my mind. I remember him telling me that in the jungle, in the Atlanta Mata, which is where the sort of jungle arrives at the sea. And he was walking along and he was saying, love your tormentors. So I think the first thing you have to do is love your tormentors. The second thing you have to do is not give an inch. I mean, I teach people, let's say, on Ayahuasca, when they see, let's say, demonic beings, because you see heavens and you see hells in the Ayahuasca. It teaches you to become a broader person.
Yeah.
Showing you a perspective of both sides. And I told them, listen, put your front foot forward, put your hands up to your face like a Zen fighter, and don't give 1 inch of ground. And then you've got to realize that you're surrounded by dysfunction. So you have to bring people along gently, or you have to just allow them to be angry and to be dysfunctional and keep out of their way. Because one of the great secrets of the spiritual journey is you have to learn not to control. You control yourself and you let the rest of the world do what it wants to do.
Good advice indeed, I think. And there's one thing I wanted to bring up with you, Stuart, which is to do with technology. We've already mentioned, and you've spoken at length about the senses and the extrasensory perceptions that so many people have that appear to be buried. Do you think that technology is a way of mimicking that as we see advances in technology? For example, mobile phones could be seen as a replacement for extrasensory telekinetic ability. We've all these gadgets and things that do things for us and connect people. Whereas if you look at ancient knowledge, and especially Latin American shamanic knowledge, they speak about how all of this is already inherent in us and that we have this ability if we could just discover it again for ourselves, and that there is no need for this modern technology. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's very true. I mean, we do have a very heightened sense of awareness. And, nobody knows where it comes from. I mean, some people say it's a higher self, that there's like a higher spiritual entity inside of us that offers us, ESP and intuition and so forth. I don't know if we can activate it enough to be able to sort of use it instead of a telephone. But yeah, you can see how the world, as it begins to sort of move information around in vast quanta, is really only mimicking the spiritual world, where grace delivers vast quantities of information as well. And then there's the ugly side of technology. It's a sort of, like, I've worked on a couple of brain tumors that I've healed, and I've healed various cancers and just general ailments that humans have.
Yeah.
But the brain tumors, I'm sure, come from mobile phone use, too much of it. And so it's important for people to use the earpiece and hold the phone, down in their hand. And of course, a gentleman should not put a phone in a pocket because it fries their ability to reproduce and so forth. So it's dangerous. That's the black side, isn't it? The surveillance, the sickness, and so forth. I mean, the internet's fantastic, but it's given rise to this massive pornographic, pedophilia and all that stuff. So there's a dark and a light in technology, isn't it? But then there's a dark and a light in the inner world. There's the hell world on the left and the celestial world on the right.
Well, that's it, and it's the concept of duality, I suppose, and it is everywhere around us and within us and without us. So what of the concept of as above, so below? Because we hear this so often, and I think it can be quite difficult for a lot of people to describe. And when people hear phrases like that, they think automatically, in a lot of cases, of Masonic or occult secret society knowledge and that kind of thing. You've done quite a bit of work on what is above us and, I suppose, the world outside of the Earth and the universe, or multiverse per se. So how can people begin to forge their own path of knowledge with regard to the universe and different dimensions? Because there will be a lot of people listening who will think, right, the guy's been talking for the last hour and I don't get any of it. I know there's something up with the world and I know there is more out there, but I don't know how to begin my own journey because it just seems too big for me.
I think they should sit on their bed at 3:03 a.m. in the morning, which is a very strong time, and they should pray. When I was 20, I was going along a road in Putney in London, there was a little church, and I pulled into this church, and I went into the back of the church, and there was a man playing an organ above me in the choir loft, and he was playing a Bach fugue. And I knelt in this church as a 20-year-old scallywag in London, and I said, God, make me truly wise. So I prayed for wisdom. I didn't pray for a girlfriend or a sports car or fame and fortune. I prayed for wisdom. And so I would say to people, sit in your bed at 3:03 in the morning and say, guide me. And then do the other things that I suggested, like process your shadow, meditate, become calm, become uncluttered, become the warrior sage, the Zen monk that's got a bloody big stick in case anybody does to cause trouble.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of not being inert. You know, a lot of people are just so inert and so dumbed down and unable to move, you know. So, hey, tonight, go join the Crystal Meditation Group. It really doesn't matter if you don't agree with it entirely, but just to be in the society and in the lingo and the understanding. And then, if all else fails, you can read my books, because the whole thing's laid out there. But I'm not in the business of pushing books. But, yeah, you can read my books. I wrote a book called The Art of Redemption that lays out all of that hell world stuff and what to do about it and so forth. I mean, there are knowledgeable teachers out there that will show you that know, you know, that know.
And it's not necessarily then about casting off all the, well, I was going to use the word shackles, it's the wrong word, but all of the luxuries that we're used to in modern society. I suppose so many of those can go hand in hand with a spiritually enlightened person.
Definitely. I mean, I was talking to somebody who knows Gerald Chalenta, who was on in Dublin.
Yeah.
And he writes the Trend Journal. He's a sort of forecaster. And they were saying that Gerald doesn't have a mobile phone and he doesn't have a laptop. And I thought, how interesting that this man that runs this fairly large business doesn't have any of those devices. I do have a laptop, but I got rid of my telephone because it's just such a nightmare. But yeah, you don't necessarily need the things you think you need. But then again, the luxuries of life are there and we're there for us to enjoy them. I think it's like if they control you, then you're finished. But if you control them, all well and good. So if you can put your iPhone in a drawer and not take it out for a month, you're in charge.
Well, yeah, I've personal experience of that. I was in Thailand about a year and a half ago, and I deliberately didn't bring my mobile phone. There was no work involved when I was over there, and for the first 2 days I felt completely naked. And following that, I didn't miss it one little bit, to the point where I would limit my mobile phone use as much as possible. And you're dead right when you say that we don't necessarily need the things that we say we need. For example, we got on fine before mobile phones, and if they were to disappear in the morning, while there would be an adjustment process, I assume we would get on fine again without them.
Well, I do have an old mobile phone that sometimes I take with me, but I take the battery and the SIM card out, so like nobody could track you via the mobile phone. Not that I've got anything to hide, but it's just that feeling of like, oh, Big Brother's watching you. And that particular sort of mobile phone that's in 3 little bits, I can assemble it if, let's say, I get a flat tire at 3 o'clock in the morning in the rain and I need somebody to come and get me.
Yeah.
So you can use the phone more as like a vital emergency thing rather than day to day, you know, texting and phoning and talking and so forth. And so I recommend that to people. Say, look, maybe keep your mobile phone, disconnect it all, take the battery out and only assemble it when and if you've got to call somebody because you're running late to the airport or something.
And then the key to it all, I would imagine, is to approach everything with an open mind and to question and to never assume that things are necessarily what we are told by an external third or fourth or fifth party or whatever it might be. The news being a big example of that, everybody will look at it, well, not everybody, but so many people look at the news and they think, all right, well, that is exactly what's happening in the world and there can be no other perspective. It's about perspective and personal power in that sense.
It is, and also I say to people, believe everything. Just believe every last crazy theory you hear, and then evaluate and get rid of the ones that are really loop-proof. But by being open and being able to sit at a lecture where somebody's, let's say, saying stuff you don't agree with, there's no point in getting all uptight and twitchy. Hey, hear the man out, or hear the lady out, let's find out what she has to say. And then you can evaluate it and reject it later. So one factor of openness is to sort of be open to everything, believe in everything, and then decide what you feel is safe or that warrants your attention or your investment if it involves, I don't know, buying a book or getting a CD or whatever, you know.
Yeah. And you're in Ireland at the moment, Stuart. You're embarking on a tour of sorts. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a very low-key tour. I started off at St. Patrick's Well at Clonmel, doing these hands-on healings. And I just posted a healing on my site. A solicitor from Galway bought his auntie, and she was dying of cancer. The doctors had written her off. And she's been cured. The doctors can't find the cancer. 99.9% clear, they say. So it's like offering people a second chance. And I've done St. Patrick's Well and Cork and Kinsale Head, and this weekend I was in Kenmare and Dingle, and I'll be at Athlone and Donegal Town and Cavan and Waterford and Wicklow, and I'm going to finish in Dublin sort of sometime before Christmas, and then I'm going to leave it for a year or so, and then I'll come back to Ireland.
And how can people find out? Is it on your website, stuartwilde.com?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a seminar in Amsterdam on the 8th of December and the 16th of December, and so that involves lectures and stuff like that. But when they're all over, then I do the healings at night, and there's other healers that come there with me. So that's December the 8th and December the 16th in Amsterdam. But the other healings I do, you just go to stuartwilde.com and you click healings. And the healings have got one unique feature which I want to mention before we come off the topic. All the healings are free, and I do not accept donations. Absolutely not, 1 shilling. You can't give me 6 eggs or a bottle of wine. I do not accept it. So that keeps it very clean, and people are not sitting there thinking, how much am I going to give this place? You know? The answer is you've got to give him nothing, and he won't accept a donation from you either. So that allows it to be very sort of soft and sweet.
Well, that's a unique and admirable approach to the whole thing, I must say.
Well, I've done 3,400 and something healings in the last couple of months. So I've done a lot of them. It's not like as if I'm doing like 1 or 2 or 3. I did 700 at a seminar in Las Vegas recently, over 1 weekend. So there you go. Yeah, it's a new way of operating. Just don't ask people for anything, don't take anything from them. Because people are always being bludgeoned into something, aren't they? It's not the tax man, it's the speeding ticket, or it's the, it's like there's all stuff coming through your letterbox that's trying to milk you, and here's a place where you can go and, receive a purple light, a special healing, and there's absolutely no charge involved, and I don't accept donations. That's it.
Fantastic. Well, of course, people can check out Stuart Wilde, that's StuartWilde.com for all the information, and of course for your books as well, of which there are 20, and I would highly recommend people dig into those and get cracking on them. Stuart, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking with you for the first time on Alchemy Radio. No doubt we shall again in the future. Enjoy your tour of Ireland, and have you any kind of message for all the new spiritual warriors who are about to embark on their journeys?
Believe in yourself, but put your left foot forward and don't give 1 inch of ground.
I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. Stuart Wilde, it's been fantastic speaking with you today on Alchemy Radio. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Alchemy Radio.